Hello, BookTube. We're continuing with my 2023 library tour, going through every one of the print and paper books that I have. If there's time at the end of the year, we can go through every one of the ebooks that I have, but that will require a lot of time. We're still in very early days, but I thought we'd do another shelf today, and you're going to notice something about this shelf. A number of you have emailed me about this particular quality. You're going to notice that these books are not arranged in any kind of order. The paperbacks aren't all with the paperbacks. The subject matters aren't all with the subject matters. That's absolutely true. And to the 4 or 5 of you who have emailed me and said that I should arrange them so that that's not true. I should arrange them so that all the Woodhouse is together, so that all the Patrick O'Brian is together, so that all of the nonfiction is together, so that all the fiction is together. I would ask you why I should do that. When you say you should really do that, I would ask you why I should do that. And if ultimately your answer to that question is, I should rearrange my books because that's the way you want them, well, I think you have your answer, don't you? So we'll start off in this shelf. It's another one that's not long. We'll ease our way into these library tours before we do hour-long episodes. The first book we have here is The Dinosaur Heresies by Robert Bakker. Back from the 1980s, I believe. 1986. This is the thing that kicked off his career, as he puts it in his acknowledgement section. One of his instructors said, "You can't go on being an enfant terrible forever. Sooner or later, you have to write a book." And boy, oh boy, what a book! He wrote a big book. This is oddly sized. I don't know if I have anything to. Yeah. See, this is wider than a normal book. It's wider than a normal hardcover. And it's got illustrations all throughout. It's got a Star Wars bookmark. There's little Annie. Oh, my, you've grown up. I was once your nanny, but now I'll shag you and have your kid. It's got illustrations all throughout by the author. There are our ancestors, these little rodents, and a sleeping dinosaur having his tail chewed. And this is seminal, really, in a way, as far as popular dinosaur books go. If you're going, as far as works for the general public, as opposed to monographs for actual paleobiologists and whatnot, this is one of the few books that you have to have on your shelf. Another one of those books would be Dinosauria, big fat volume named Dinosauria, which I had and don't have anymore. But this is the book where famously Bakker puts forward the idea that dinosaurs were warm-blooded, that they weren't sluggish, cold-blooded reptiles that live in swamps, and that they were actually, thanks to a slightly higher oxygen content in the world then, and thanks to their lightweight, compartmentalized, basically hollow bones, they could grow to enormous sizes without needing to be sluggish, and certainly without being activated by heat. We know that dinosaurs lived in cold climates. Plenty of them did. It's fascinating and funny. It doesn't deal just with that. It deals with the mechanics of dinosaur motion and all sorts of other things about dinosaurs that really, ultimately, the book conveys the wonder of the discipline. So even though it's, a half a century outdated in terms of the latest information about dinosaurs, for instance, one way that you could tell that, the dinosaurs that are on the cover are both naked. They have no feathers or hairs or feathery-like protuberances of any kind. I think if we could take a time machine back to look at an actual T-Rex, I don't think the animal would look much like this. I think we would consider it odd. It would look naked. But I could be wrong about that. The research continues, and books keep coming out. There are other dinosaur books in this room. Okay, well, this next book is about dinosaurs of a different kind. This is a great book. Actually, I would like to think that all of the books here in the little book room, this is where we're starting our tour, is my little book room, my little sanctum sanctorum, which is the smallest room at Hyde Cottage, except for one. It's entirely lined with books and paintings and memorabilia. It's got a tiny little World War I metal-framed bed and one window. And it is the place where I can go and shut the door. And I've got I've got a power strip with a plug. I've got a laptop and an iPad mini that live in this room. They don't ever go anywhere else. They live in this room. They have a power cord in this room. So that if I'm feeling it, I can simply pick up the bean, or in previous years, tell all the dogs to follow me into this room, close the door, and just recharge. Everybody should have a space like this. Everybody should. It doesn't have to have quite so many books in it. This has 2,000 books in it, but it doesn't have to have that. But you should have a space that is not part of anyone else's space. But this, to use a cheesy segue, this book is about a house with lots and lots of spaces like that. This is Knole and the Sackvilles by Vita Sackville West. This is an old hardcover. I had a trade paperback of this forever and ever that was really pretty. It was one of the main staircases at Knole, one of the set piece things that you get on the tour. But the trade paperback kept falling apart, and I kept rebuying the trade paperback. I kept going to the bookstore and rebuying the trade paperback. Then I found this hardcover at the Brattle in 2020 and thought, well, it's not as pretty as the trade paperback, but it's a lot more durable. And believe it or not, that is Knole on the cover. It's a house that covers acres and acres. The house does. Just the house, not the land. It's surrounded by beautiful land, deer parks that are, if you live in England, you really should make a point of at some point going to see Knole. Walk around the grounds, walk around the deer park, walk around the house. It is still occupied by the Sackville family. Parts of the Sackville family live here. But most of it is open to the public, and you can just walk around and look at it. There are tours. Always check ahead. But there are tours, and it's amazing. The house itself has been added onto, and has entered into story and fable, and that is what Vita Sackville West does in this book. She was heir to the family, and Knole would have been hers had she been a male. It would have been hers. Instead, very bitterly, it passed away from her and is now part of the National Trust. But this is the story of she roams all across the 5 centuries of Knole's history, all the Sackvilles and the archbishops that lived in the house and the royalty that came to visit and the history that it saw. And she sets down at different periods and writes about those periods, and it's amazing, just amazing. It reminds you how blazingly talented a writer Vita Sackville West could be. She wasn't always that. I maintain that some of her fiction is god-awful, drippy stuff. But maybe I need to revisit it. I always say that, and I always do revisit it, and I always come up with that same thing. I go in with guns blazing with the best of intentions and come out thinking, the similarity between Vita Sackville West and her famous lover, Virginia Woolf, is that when they were both on the top of their form, they wrote better than anybody in Bloomsbury, than anybody in England, than anybody in the world at the time. And the difference is that Virginia Woolf never let any writing see the light of day that wasn't at that pitch. If she wasn't feeling it, then she notoriously just let it go. And deadlines and schedules would just go to hell while editors and publishers waited for her. And so there's a remarkable evenness to her published works. And Vita Sackville West wasn't that way. But this is genius. Right through genius. An amazing collection of stories. There's one of the Sackvilles. I believe that is the first Sackville Duke. The Sackvilles started off as earls, and then eventually they brown-nosed their way up to dukes. And the book is full of amazing moments, because Vita Sackville West grew up in Knole, constantly being admonished by her relatives that a large part of this enormous sprawling house is essentially a museum, and you're not to touch anything because it's full of incredibly valuable stuff, just full of paintings and tapestries and bed hangings and pewterware, that just, even the woodwork itself, the carving on some of the benches and the staircases is just unbelievable. Like I said, if you go to England and you're thinking, well, I've only got a week, I suppose I should do the Tower of London, I suppose I should see the Ravens, etc., etc. I would strongly, or if you've only got a week, you definitely got to see the Tower of London. But you should make your way out to the countryside and see Knole. And if you live in England already, put it on the list. It's amazing. Wandering around in it is amazing. Okay, then this next one is also very similar to Knole and the Sackvilles, although it's never, to my mind, I would bet, in human history been compared to it. In that, it's a ramble. It's a ramble around acres and acres of real estate, only this is imaginative real estate. This is science real estate. This is another work of popular science. This is The Ancestor's Tale by Richard Dawkins. I believe in later iterations of this book, it has a co-author assigned on the cover. But this was the original hardcover. I got it. It came out before Dawkins really achieved a kind of social media notoriety. And I have to remind myself over and over again that I don't care about social media notoriety one way or another. I care about real world notoriety. But this has nothing to do with new atheism, has nothing to do with anything like that. This is Dawkins taking the general, non-specialized reader through the stories of evolution by natural selection. All the different things that it does, all the latest thinking at the time that this came out in the 1990s, I believe. This is the 1990s. 2004. This came out in 2004, so 20 years ago. And he takes you through all kinds of things, the evolution of bipedalism, the development multiple times, 4 times of flight, of powered flight, the development of the eye. And he's amazing when he does it. He is really in his element when he's teaching this sort of stuff, and when he's leaving any kind of controversy alone. I think he likes courting controversy. I think that it's probably something akin to a drug addiction. Those of you who have seen it happen to other people might know that it can become a drug addiction, and I think it leads to poor work or to uncontrolled egomania, or both. Uncontrolled egomania would certainly explain Dawkins' memoirs. They are unbelievable. They are believable. I'm sure that everything in them happened, but they're unbelievable that anyone would think they were a wise idea to publish. But this is, I guess you could say, a depersonalized Dawkins. This is Dawkins the teacher, and he's amazing at it. There's an eye-opening, amazing realization on literally every page of this book. So, I cannot recommend it strongly enough, even if I don't actually know the whole story behind the fact that all new editions have a co-writer on board. I don't actually know the story behind that. I'm gathering from what Richard Dawkins has sort of degenerated into, I'm gathering that it is not a gesture of generosity. I'm gathering that it was spiteful, done spitefully somehow. We have some sort of emergency going on. But the only thing that beats running all of your sirens for an emergency is driving at 1 mile an hour, because that way you'll make the loudest amount of noise for the longest amount of time, annoying the most amount of people, and you're also guaranteed to be late for the emergency. So it's win-win. Anyway, I don't know the nature of that co-writing thing. Richard Dawkins, as he is now in the 21st century, doesn't strike me as the type of person who would wake up one morning, put on his socks, and say, I really should give so-and-so credit for having helped me so much with that book. He doesn't strike me as that type of person, so I would imagine that person probably went to him and said, look, if you don't do this, I've got the goods and I'll expose you. I don't know, but the book, regardless of how many names are on the cover, is amazing. The content wasn't changed when that name was added. Oh, what do we got here? A very pretty paperback. Oh, great, okay. Yes, this is Northwestern University. Well, I wish they still did these. This is Venetian Life by William Dean Howells. A collection of sketches of what it was like to live in Venice in the 1860s. So before Venice really became the multi-billion-dollar tourist attraction that it is now, a kind of a Disneyland on the Adriatic. But still, when Venice had a magic to it, a very palpable magic to it, Venice had that magic for centuries before Howells got there. It was in the Venice that he encounters in these sketches, it's a kind of relaxed, sloppy magic. But you can't fail to feel it. Even when he was there, it comes through in every page of this book. I think, this is going to be predictable, I know I'm going to say this in practically every shelf tour, but I prefer Howells' nonfiction to his fiction. even The Rise of Silas Lapham, even Hazard for New Fortunes, both of which I think are really good books. His nonfiction, I think, is much better. He's much more at his ease. He's much less writing starchly for the approval of the muses on Mount Helicon, and that brings out the best in him. And this book, these sketches, resulted from a bit of greasing the wheels. Howells was a very young man. He was a young man on the make. He knew that he had a penchant for writing, for prose, and he also knew, almost as importantly, that he had a penchant for writing prose quickly that would be clean when it came off his pen. That isn't given to everybody. Far more talented writers couldn't do that. But he learned early on that he could do that and started selling that ability to the highest bidder. And in the case of the sketches here, these are the result of the highest bidder being Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln needed a campaign biography, promise to keep, a promise of integrity, and integrity of promise. You know the kind of campaign biography that I'm talking about. They were far more important in 1860 than they are now. People, in fact, don't write, really, I don't think they write campaign biographies now, or not many of them do. They write things after the fact. Because we've got a 24-hour news cycle with cameras stuck in your faces at all times. So the purpose of a campaign biography was to introduce the candidate to the hinterlands, which was 99% of the country, to introduce the candidate to people who've never heard of them, don't know anything about them. So take that candidate, gin up a good story, try to make it non-falsifiable in its bare-bone basics. You don't want to say that your candidate wept pious tears over the grave of his dear saintly mother, and then have her go to the New York Tribune and say, "I'm still alive, damn it, and I'm not voting for him." You don't want that to happen. So it takes a skilled hand, and Howells wrote Lincoln's campaign biography. I always mean to ask my friend Zach at the Brattle Bookshop if the originals of that campaign biography by Howells are valuable, and whether or not there is one that Lincoln signed for Howells. I know that Lincoln did that, but I don't know that volume survives. I don't know that Howells might have had it burned when he was on his deathbed or whatnot. But in exchange for writing that, you might be thinking now, you naive 21st century creatures might be thinking, oh, so Howells went and took a vacation in Venice because with the money that Abraham Lincoln paid him for his campaign biography. No. Howells wrote the campaign biography, and then when Lincoln won, Lincoln made him a consul. He made him a diplomat and sent him to Venice, which you'd think would be an important job. You'd think that someone would want that job. Howells didn't particularly want it and didn't particularly like it, because at the time, I won't say as now, in case anyone was watching, but at the time it was a complete sinecure. It had no work. You entertained people, and you had the beginnings of a budget to do that. You entertained people. You were expected not to be an open disgrace, although not every consul in the 19th century could manage that, and that was it. And that that might sound like paradise to you, to be sent to Venice to live with no work to do, all expenses paid. But Howells had a Midwestern work ethic, and it bothered him a lot. It got worse and worse. In fact, I think you can kind of sort of see hints of it here, even though most of these things are written in retrospect. I think he captures his own mind fairly well. I have a great many Venice books. I used to live in Venice, and I lived there for quite some time. I didn't just go to visit. I wasn't just a tourist. I went and took rooms and lived there for quite some time. Fell absolutely in love with it. It's my second favorite place on earth. If I didn't live in Boston, I would live in Venice. I don't know that it would be possible to live in Venice now. I might have to live in some low-rent district on the mainland and go into Venice for my lunch. but ordinary people still live there, so I might find a way. It helps to be able to speak the language. It helps to be able to connect with people, including somebody that might be a landlord, might have a little room. I don't require much space. My dogs and I didn't require much space. The irony when I lived in Venice is that although I didn't require much space I had my dogs, I had my beagles, and I also collected a group of street dogs. And the irony is that although we didn't require much space, we would have been happy in just this space. The space that I lived in when I lived in Venice was huge. It was sprawling. It was this old decrepit building with, I guess we would call it an apartment now. there was a subdivided part of it that the landlady rented out to me, and it was sprawling. It was 10 times the space that I needed. But anyway, if we start telling stories about Venice, we'll be here all day. Let's see what's next here. Oh, great. Okay, I had this in a trade paperback. Then I waited and waited, and I found, in 2020, I found a hardcover with a library covering on it, and I grabbed it, got rid of my trade paperback. This is David Carroll. This is A Swamp Walker's Journal. And it is a day-by-day account of his encounters with a wetland here in America. And it's beautifully illustrated by the author. Just beautifully. It really, really did have, here, let me show you. I want to show you a couple of these because he is really talented. He's a really talented artist, and his artwork runs all throughout this book. Look at that. More dancers. He's a really talented artist. He's also a really talented writer. Oh, his favorite. His favorite. Turtles were his favorite. He takes you through just the very humble biology of the wetlands. Who lives there, what their yearly cycle is like, what it's like to experience that world, walk around in it. It can be, I have an extensive experience walking around in wetlands, and it can be a nightmare, especially if you have dogs with you. But even if you don't, I've done a lot of walking around in wetlands without any dogs with me, and it's an insect's paradise. And there can be sucking mud. There's often sucking mud, and lots of unpleasant things live there. Lots and lots of unpleasant things live there. No offense to David's precious box turtles, but snapping turtles live there as well. 30 pounds of bad temper that can take your arm off if you put it down in the wrong place. As well as bigger things. Wetlands are usually they're a regular source of fresh water, which means they can attract deer, bobcats, and bears. It's entirely possible that you could be tromping your way through a bit of shallow mud in a wetland, and suddenly the reeds right next to you part, and it's a bear's head looking at you, wondering who was tromping there and whether or not they're edible, and not really sure that you aren't edible. So, this is nature writing of the absolute first order. All of this author's books are amazing. All of them are, and they're all in this room somewhere. Notice they're not all together, but that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that at all. Then what else here? Oh, fantastic. Oh my. Wonderful. All right, well, all of this author's books are in this room too. This is Arundel by Kenneth Roberts. This is a hardcover with an N.C. Wyeth cover there. A historical novel by an author who started his career 100 years ago and is now completely forgotten. He wrote Rabble in Arms. He wrote Northwest Passage. This is his historical novel of his set in the American Revolution. Whenever I say on this channel that I don't think a really great American Revolution novel has been written, people always come back to me with Kenneth Roberts, with Rabble in Arms and Arundel. Arundel is about, Rabble in Arms and Arundel are about, really they're about Benedict Arnold, the notorious American traitor, only before he was a traitor, when he was simply an inept general. This is the story of the Battle of Quebec. And Rabble in Arms is, among other things, a continuation of that story. But they aren't part one and part two, and they're amazingly, rousingly good historical fiction, textured as could be. The only reason that I don't usually include them that I don't consider them exceptions when I say there's not been a great American Revolution novel is because they're very pointillist. They're very local. Arundel was the original white settler name for the Kennebunk region of Maine, which is one of 3 regions of Maine that I know really, really well. I know it really, really well for reasons that are totally different from the reasons I know the other 2 parts really well. These are, Roberts was in his heart a local historian. I think he was one of the greatest local historians who's ever been a local historian of anything. And he was so good in conveying his knowledge and passion about the events that happened in the locale that he's very specifically concentrating on, but also firing you up for how those events reflect and influence the broader events in places where you don't live, or where you do live, where he doesn't live. He was so good at doing that you really lose track of the fact that books like Arundel or Boone Island or Rabble in Arms are local. You kind of lose sight of that fact because you're just swept along in the story. He is such a great storyteller. he is such a great storyteller. It's always heartbreaking to me, and I think Mark Richardson would probably agree with me here. We've over a wee bit of wine late at night, we have talked about Kenneth Roberts. I think he would probably agree with me that it's a terrible shame in this case that he is forgotten. Plenty of second-rate authors from the early part of the 20th century are forgotten, and that's no skin off anybody's nose. But Roberts, all of you historical fiction fans would really like him. You would really like his work. I bet a lot of you just general fiction fans would. And the fact that the tides of taste or whatever, or maybe copyright, maybe his family is contentious to deal with when it comes to his literary legacy, I don't know. I don't know if Mark knows. But whatever the reason, you won't encounter him when you go to a bookstore, a new bookstore. And you often won't encounter him when you go to a used bookstore either. You're most likely to see his books just moldering away in somebody's yard sale when they're clearing out their house in early summer. And that's a terrible shame, because a huge amount of effort and research went into his books, and a huge amount of dramatic insight as well. He's such a hell of a writer. That this is fairly typical. Mark Richardson doesn't, of course, make as many videos as I would like him to make, as a lot of you would like him to make. He's a kind of a busy guy, but when he has made videos, we strike a lot of common notes when it comes to writing and reading and books that are now forgotten. And one of the things you will regularly hear us say about writers like, specifically, Samuel Eliot Morison or Kenneth Roberts, is that in addition to everything else we like about them, they're fantastic reading experiences, and it's a terrible shame that they're forgotten. On that fact alone, it's a terrible shame that they're forgotten. Roberts would be right up in that list. There's a lot of other Roberts in this room. Arundel is not the only one. There are a few Roberts books that I don't have. I think I have them all in ebook, but there are a couple of hardcovers that I don't think I have. But I have a few in this room. We'll get to them. And then what is this last one for this shelf? Oh, wow. Okay, great. Fantastic. All right. A lot of the books on this shelf have plastic library covers. That was not intentional. This is To the Harbor Light by Henry Beadle Huff, who was a fixture on the island of Martha's Vineyard off the coast of Massachusetts. For a long, long time, he was a fixture of Martha's Vineyard. And for a long time, he was the editor of the Martha's Vineyard Gazette, a broadsheet newspaper that comes out once a week in Martha's Vineyard, and that took all his blood, sweat, and tears, took a lot of his passion. He made it into a truly interesting, substantial local newspaper and made it beloved. And I think this is a memoir of him when he was quite old. I think he was almost 80. He wrote a memoir about life in that one year, but also life just in general, flashes just in general. He'd done a huge amount of writing at this point. So there are stories in here that occur in earlier books, but I think a large part of he would have disagreed with this completely, but he's not here to disagree with me now. So I think a large part of why the Vineyard Gazette under his editorship became so beloved is because he was so beloved by everybody. I could be wrong about that. I'm not meaning to slight his editorial efforts. He did there was a lot of great work in that old Vineyard Gazette. And I know the vineyard really well. I have been to the vineyard in all weathers and all seasons many, many, many times for many, many years. There's not a tree stand or a pond that I don't know intimately well. And I came to know him. I started out, as so many things do with me, it started out with me smooching his dog. Actually, this book might be old enough to have... There is our author. There is the lighthouse in the background, and there is his dog, this wonderful rickety old collie. It started off with me face smooching the dog, and then it moved on to talking with the owner, and then it moved on to visiting the Gazette offices and talking there about books and writing and newspaper work. By this point, I'd had some newspaper work under my belt myself, and those conversations led often to him saying, well, why don't you review a book for me? Or write a column for me, do something for me. As long as you're here every year, why don't you do that? And I kept saying, oh, no, I'm kind of out of the newspaper game, and I wouldn't have anything interesting to say. I had sort of lost the topspin that comes with regularly producing work. And once you lose that topspin, you can have a moment where you wonder if you can get it back. I had that moment. If I can have it, anybody can have it, considering what a wheedling egomaniac I am. I didn't think anything of it. And my visits to the vineyard grew less and less frequent as I traveled and went elsewhere. And then eventually the author of this wonderful book died. And I was sorry about that. That was a light gone from the world. And I thought nothing of it. And now, all these years later, I am writing book reviews for the Martha's Vineyard Gazette. I may even someday go back and stand in that building again. If it's the same building, I don't know. Is it the same room? It won't look the same. I guarantee it won't look the same. I don't know if I'll even be able to speak if that happens. But I am writing book reviews for the Vineyard Gazette. I wish that I had, like so many instances like this, I wish that I could go back to that earlier version of me and slap him across the face and say, look, just keep writing. Just keep writing. Write constantly. If you want to become a bookseller in a retail bookstore, go ahead and do it. But keep writing. Keep reviewing. Keep writing columns. If you want to move around, well, you can mail your work in. Plenty of people do that. This author would gladly have taken my work from anywhere where I happen to be in the world. It's a regret. We all have them. I wish that I had done that, but in this particular case, the sting is taken out of the regret by the fact that I have come full circle and am writing for the Vineyard Gazette. I review books for them whenever a book crosses my editor's desk. My editor is a wonderful guy. It must be something in the building that makes editors of the Gazette into wonderful guys. But anyway, this video's gone long, hasn't it? Sorry. Lots and lots of stories. And even though I could have gone on about Kennebunkport, oh my God, could I have gone on about Kennebunkport for two different reasons. I could have gone on and on about tramping in wetlands. Oh my God, I may have tramped in more wetlands than David Carroll has. I could have gone on and on about Venice. Oh my, a million stories and a million stories about the vineyard. So consider yourselves lucky that we got out in 32 minutes. I will try to make tomorrow's shorter. Thank you, BookTube.